Jewish rabbi talk about this a couple weeks ago, and it was really interesting. He had some different interpretations of things, although as I got more into it and started to read some more, I decided to keep with the traditional ones because the people that I really trust in translation were staying with the traditional translation of it, but it still has, I think, an emphasis that is not usually brought up in more popular settings. It's the shepherd psalm, but the shepherd, we're the sheep, he is the shepherd, and it's how he sees us and how he cares for the sheep. I know there's whole series of books and commentaries on that, but some of the most popular are the Keller books, and he has a series, I don't know how many he has, on the shepherd. He was a shepherd. I don't know much more about him than that. I do know he was a shepherd. I know that herding sheep is different from herding other kinds of animals. You have to lead sheep. You cannot drive them like you can drive cows or horses or other larger animals. Sheep, they fan out and scatter, and they want to be behind you, not in front of you. And so they're always curious of what you're doing, and they'll be turning around, and they just lose their place. They won't follow. Now, they will follow other animals and stuff. And I was reading on the Israeli military, the IDF, and one of the things they do in leadership training is they put their officers in pens with sheep, and they have to figure out interesting feat, because they, like I said, they can't be driven, they can't be pushed out of the pen or down through the pasture, because they just fan out and go and turn around and look at you and see what you're doing, and that's how they just keep doing that. But they will keep your eyes on whoever's in front, but you have to get them to follow you first. And although shepherds can train the sheep to follow all kinds of representatives, they'll follow the head ewe, not the male goat or the male sheep, the buck. They won't follow him, but they'll follow the ewe. And part of the challenge in military leadership is finding which one is the ewe, the mama sheep. And once you've done that, then you just have to focus on her and get her to do what you want. If you can get her to do what you want, then everybody else will do it too. They'll follow them. Now, and you have to build trust. And you can also build that confidence in your donkey. They'll follow the donkey. And in fact, donkeys are often used not only as just for practical purposes, but they are used a lot in management of sheep. And if it's the shepherd's donkey, they will follow it wherever it goes. And which is kind of an interesting thing. He starts with the Yahweh. He's using the personal name for God, Yahweh, rather than just a title. And you can take that. You can see the personal relationship with Jesus and his followers. He said, "My sheep hear my voice, and they follow me," and that's true. Sheep will follow the shepherd just by the sound of his voice, but they will also follow his donkey or some other, like a horse or a donkey, they'll follow them. Donkeys are used that way a lot. The Lord, Yahweh, is my shepherd, and I shall not want. You know, the relationship we have with God, it goes clear back to the Garden of Eden, which is kind of in the background of this psalm. Is you know, God has set up the Garden of Eden. He set up, there's tasks for men to do, there's labor, of taking care of the garden, and that. And there's all kinds of provisions inside the garden as we cultivate and take care of it. It also takes care of us. And he says that the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And he makes me lie down in green pastures. And you know, there's a need sometimes in animal to get them to rest. I know cows are really good at resting. They like to rest. I know sheep, how they behave in that way. I've never really actually handled sheep. I've done a lot of cows, but and he leads me beside still quiet waters. He restores my soul, and he guides me in paths of righteousness. I like to restore my soul. Our consciousness in that is, if you know, he restores us. And when I look at this psalm, at overall, the restoration of the soul is part of the shepherd, his role. We talk a lot about that here because I talked a lot about the soul, the nephesh, you know, our life. God restores it. We're trained here. We're raised up for eternity. And I don't think most people get that at all. Because even churches, they focus so much on the materials and the pleasures and materials and desires of this world and this life. And churches make it a theme. Now, a lot of those churches are failing. We've talked about that. Over 1,500 mega churches, which seem to all have the same kind of message, that it is a self-help church. And a lot of big self-help churches are failing. And, you know, but the Lord is our shepherd, and he takes care of not our desires and our passions, but he makes us to be at rest with him, and he restores our life. And, you know, it is the role of the shepherd to bring us into life. You know, we're taking this life and going into the next. When I was studying the famous psychiatrist, you know, it was interesting to me to see how he, you know, come to his conclusions. He had experienced being in heaven itself, had the actual presence of God, or whatever he thought was in heaven, mighty creatures or individuals with great power and might. And as I shared with you, later on, I discovered that he had a mistress, and he kept that mistress through his whole experience with death and life. And over a period of time, most people could not understand that the image that he got from heaven and earth. And he describes heaven pretty literal, and it matches very closely with a lot of other very powerful, very strong visions of eternity. And so I took it very seriously. But as he thinks through it, because he is a young man when he has a heart attack and dies in a hospital, and spends some time in a vision of heaven itself. But as he struggles with it into his older ages, he has this relationship with this lady that's wanting to become a psychotherapist herself, and she actually does. She's a very well-known psychotherapist in Europe, Eastern Europe. But he has a family, has a wife and children and everything, but he justifies this relationship with this lady because they have understanding of spirituality and understanding of the afterlife. And I think his family, he being a Freudian psychotherapist, he's an atheist, and he has a really hard time believing in an eternal being, although he meets people and talks to people in heaven. So when asked if he believed in God or some God, his standard answer was no, because believing is not the same thing as seeing, and I have seen him, and so I don't believe in him because I trust my own sense perceptions. But he did not trust his own sense perception, because in the end he rejects the actual existence of the supernatural and heaven in favor of a collective, because he has to include her in. He has to bring her into the picture. And so she really believes what he's saying. She trusts what he's saying. And whereas his family, whether he doesn't really tell them, or for some reason that connection between his family and him doesn't happen, and he only connects with her. And so he finally interprets God in a collective sense, and that God is the collection of people who can see into the spiritual world, okay? And he has some kind of a collection like that, which to me rejects his vision, actually. And she moves on. She moves on and has a career and does her own thing. But, and he got older, so that's what happened there. But he leads me into quiet waters, and he restores my soul. He restores the life that we have, and our consciousness, and our ability to experience not only this world, but the next world. In fact, I was listening to an Indian physicist just this week, and he's talking about not so much consciousness, but reality. What is reality? And that because in quantum physics and the new physics, and this is across the board, it's not really debated as I've been able to find. It is, what it means is really talked about. And that, since E equals mc squared, all mass is energy. But the other thing about reality is that the energy is organized according to codes. And in the life code we have is DNA and RNA, and I finally read some articles on that so I could get a better picture of it. But they're not languages, they're computer codes, because they don't just go one direction. The DNA can be read, I don't even know if they know how many different directions, because you can read it in a straight line from one side to the other, going both directions, but you can also read the folds, And you can go down just the folds, pick up this fold, that one, that one, that one. And they're sending out codes, information, and receiving stuff. And so it's like a living code. I mean, it's not just, in my first mind was to see it as just a language going one direction. But I realize that's not how it works. I mean, it does work that way, but it works in a lot of ways. And I'm not sure people really know exactly how complex the DNA code is. And for one person, and I've forgotten the numbers on this, but it goes to the sun and back a certain number of times. I mean, it's huge. The language just for one person is a huge language, it's a huge library of information. I saw another picture, a recent picture of the cell, and here's a cell that I learned when I was in school. It's got 4 parts, right? And a cell today looks like a big city on a microscope. And you can watch the trash. People go around the cell taking out trash, and it has all kinds of things going on in it. And in fact, we know from genetic diseases that one cell, one thing in there can go haywire, and that person gets very, very sick or dies. They don't handle random mutations and accidents. They don't handle it. As far as evolving, the most interesting thing on it is if you want to study that, is James Tour, and his concept, his response to evolutionists is, you think you have more time to get this cell to become what it's supposed to become. He said, but in genetics, time is not your friend. Time is not your friend, because you only have days to work with that cell. You don't have millions and millions of years. You got a few days, and that's it. So he said, when our experience, making cells, if it goes bad, it takes years to regroup and rebuild and redesign and figure out what went wrong, and then we have to go find the raw material, and you have to buy it. It's very expensive to buy, and so. The very interesting. Time is not the end. God has to restore us to life, and God will. In the Shepherd, He's leading us through this journey of exploring and finding out what God has for us and why we're here. And then at the end, He has to, when we pass through the valley of death, He has to restore us back to life, which is what David believes. I mean, he said that even in the death of his son. He said, he will not come to me, but I will go to him. And he says that. He guides us in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And that's also in the prayer, in the Lord's Prayer, God, and it's in the Lord's Prayer, but it's also in Jesus' prayer in John 17, that God leads the church into righteousness. And when I'm thinking about this psalm, I'm looking at the church in America. When we look at the 23rd Psalm, it's telling us, basically giving us a path into the future. And it is not a path of longing and trying to build up selfish desires here in the now, and which is a huge problem in America, the Western church, because we so focus on our own, our own fulfillment in the desires of life. And I know when psychotherapist was talking about that, when he's first analyzing and trying to analyze his experience, he says, why do the churches, he asked this question, why do the churches spend so much time in improving this life as though they were going to be here forever. And he said, we're not going to be here forever. We're here to prepare for the next life. That's the whole purpose of being here, is to prepare for eternity. But you don't see that. You don't even see that in the churches, that they're preparing for eternity. It's like, they're going to stay here. I mean, everything is on the here and now and the pleasures of life here. And he said, people don't prepare for heaven. And he didn't either, which is the irony of the whole thing with him. He guides us in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. One of the things a favorite passage of mine, of course, is Ephesians 1. And in Ephesians 1, God has all these blessings, all of this amazing, the Trinity are in a relationship, a friendship, a loving relationship throughout eternity. And what they've been doing, I don't know. I think it's beyond my brain to figure that, even think about it, imagine it. But we're being offered, and that's why when I think of grace, I don't think on a small scale earthly. That, to me, grace isn't just getting away with stuff here. Grace is a big picture item about a infinite God who has immense wealth and blessing, and so much so that they want to create a race of people that they can bless, that they can actually share the wealth and blessing that exists in heaven with the Father and the Son. And so he's preparing us for it. But and the question is, God is only going to allow the righteous into his presence, but yet he figures out a way to expand that. And I understand that only the holy will stand before God. But God has a way. He has a way in order to solve the problems for him to be gracious and loving. And you see that in Ephesians 1. He's saying God is glorifying his mercy and grace and his compassion for us. And so he puts it in the first window of Ephesians 1. You have that window into the past and the purpose of God, his purpose and design, and that to make a world where he can just dump blessings. You also get that in Romans 5. Sin abounds, but grace superabounds. It superabounds. And which I've always struggled with that in terms of, people make sin a physical property of reality, and instead of a moral property, it's a physical property, and that grace, or the sin, it goes through the whole creation under physical laws, and then when it comes to people whom God has made this place for, to allow them a door into eternity, that's supposed to operate on different principles or different laws. And the thing that I struggled with for a long, long time is how can then sin abound and grace superabound? How does it superabound? In what way is it superabounding above sin? And when you interpret both of those as physical properties, they don't come out right. The equation, the math doesn't come out. You have sin spreading to everybody through genetics or whatever people think it is, and And then, and so that is universal. And so you go to grace, and that is limited. It's very limited, in fact. But it superabounds to a very limited number of things. So you can't, that obviously interpretation doesn't work with that, doesn't fit. And, you know, that the power of grace is the power, you have to ask the question, is the power of grace able to put people, to put population into the kingdom of heaven? And so you have that same thing in the psalm here. He restores our life. He restores us into fellowship with him and prepares us for eternity. And we receive, that's why, you know, he doesn't just restore us in the last day, the final day. Because that's not the picture we get of the final day in Scripture is that everything is going to be the same. Okay? Let the righteous be righteous, let the wicked be wicked still. And the final day does not transform sinners. It's the work of Christ in history that transforms the sinner. So he restores our soul. He guides us in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And you see that in Ephesians as well. It is the righteousness of God. It is the holiness of God that brings us to the place where we want to glorify him and worship and praise him. And that's also the theme. That's one of the major themes in the Lord's Prayer in John 17. That the church is righteous as you, Father, are and I are. And the church is also loving as you and I are. And so the psalmist again moves on. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Now, this is one of the major translation issues. You know, they have the valley of deep darkness or the valley of the shadow of death. And it has some powerful images if you think about it. You know, with this, the underground tunnels under Hamas, and with the darkness in the tunnels, and the people being held in captivity in darkness, and the darkness is colored. The only visual thing there is death itself. I mean, they don't know from day to day, you know, when the footsteps walking in the dark, somebody comes in and shoots everybody in the room, you know. And I've listened to a lot of the discussion, you know, the testimonies of people in the tunnels. And one of the guys had gone there because he was a radical. Like a lot of those people were pro-Hamas. That big party was in honor of Hamas and in honor of Gaza and the Islamic people there. And when they got a chance to kill them, they killed them. You know, brutally killed them. And so it's very ironic. The whole thing was ironic and showed that how evil is not rational. And when I've talked about that, I keep bringing that up. You know, raw evil is not rational. And it doesn't need explicit instructions on how to interpret evil. Because it isn't rational. It's irrational. But there was one guy in there that, again, was in the party. He was in the party scene. He wasn't from the villages. And he was picked up, and he is a radical politically and theologically in every way, an atheist, didn't believe in God, didn't believe in anything. And he spent 400 days in total darkness. Now, I thought that was a very good image for this, the valley of the shadow of death, or the valley of deep darkness. The kind of darkness that you would in a Hamas tunnel, that you didn't know from where things, how things are, whether even people were going to bring food and water to you for days and days and days, and but I was, is it the valley of the shadow of death or the valley of deep darkness? And the more I think about it, the more I think there's no difference. I don't think there's any difference to it. And the commentaries I read that had studied this question because of the conflict between the two words, they come to the same conclusion that there was no difference. And I imagine to that man in those Gaza tunnels, I don't think to him it would have been any different. I don't think you could make it any darker or more approaching death. Because every time you heard footsteps, the big question is, this is my last day here. But what brings total darkness like that? That kind of darkness is the question of death. And Christ takes the sting out of death, doesn't he? And so it brought me to think, why is it in the modern world that when people face evil, the biggest argument against the goodness of God and the presence of God is the presence of evil? And that has never made sense to me. It's never made any sense as to why it has a wide, acceptance in this culture, the culture that we see now. That if there's evil, there can't be good. And that's irrational. That's an irrational statement. The presence of evil takes care of it. And so I'm thinking, two things that come to mind when I started thinking that is when C.S. Lewis wrote Surprised by Joy, he talks about his time being in the tunnels and the trenches of World War I, and having to wear gas masks because they were really, using chemical weapons. Then they outlawed them in the world, and that even we were making chemical weapons after it was outlawed. So, C.S. Lewis said that he saw so many people come to the presence of God in the trenches themselves. That sitting there in the trenches, you can't jump up and shoot at 16-pound, armaments coming at you at a great velocity. In fact, the velocity now has replaced the pounds of TNT and stuff that they use. Because you can take steel, and if you can increase the velocity, it has the impact of a meteor, which doesn't have any TNT in it. It's just heavy metal. And but when they strike, they can leave holes in the earth or holes in the moon. And so it's the velocity as much as the explosion. But I'm thinking about that. These guys they're so confronted with death that they come to believe in God. Now, evil presents itself to them in 1915, something, 19. What's the difference? What's the difference between the evil we see today and the evil that C.S. Lewis saw? And he was an atheist when he went in too. And he had to think it through. And he was seeing these people in the face of evil coming to the belief in God. Whereas today, when they stub their toe or get a scratch on their face, they've got, I have to be an atheist. I hurt myself. I got to become an atheist. And I've been thinking about this because that's a really big shift in worldview and concepts of worldview. That evil would push people towards good rather than towards evil. When people see evil, they want to be more evil. That makes no sense to me. It's an irrational concept. So I was thinking about it. What is it that's doing that? And you know, I'll give you my interpretation, and you can take it or leave it. I don't care really, but it's because we have so sold young people on the idea that God is in absolute total control. So when they see the presence of evil, they according to that worldview, they see that God is the author of evil. They see that. They come to that conclusion. And I was listening to Senator Grass, who's, you know, like in stage 4 of terminal cancer. And so they were interviewing him on 60 Minutes the other day, and I was listening to it. And they're asking him, he's very well educated. He's got a doctorate in law, and he's got a doctorate in history. And it was talking about the worldview and how people perceive things, and I'm just thinking, and he also confessed to them, I am a thorough Calvinist Christian. I believe God is in absolute control of everything. And he waffled on that quite a few times during that hour. It's hard to hold that and talk about government and talk about the future of kids and everything. But you know, as I'm looking at the schools that are more moderate and the evangelical schools are shutting down. They're closing because there's no support for them, for one, and the churches aren't growing. Those churches, the evangelical free churches, shrunk down to, you know, a lot, so they couldn't support their institutions, and had to close them because they lacked support for them. And I've been looking at that and studying it and trying to figure out, because I was right in the middle of it, and I don't think people here actually understood how much we were in the middle of that. But what they thought was, they thought that if we can get all of the kids on the same theological, you know, line in one direction, that it will revive the church. I was, you know, I love the evangelical community, but it did not accept me, and it never did. And so I don't talk about it now because there's no need to. We're where we are, and we've got to live the way, you know, with what God has given to us. But the churches, if you study history, that's what that does. I mean, it always does that. You know, they pushed the Mennonites out, and then drowned them or burned them. John Calvin himself burned one of the more famous proponents of the very theological positions. He invited him for dinner, and they talked theology, and he arrested him and killed him. And that's famously thing. And why is that? You know, when you think about why is it that that's the way they respond? Because listen, if Augustine's the one that started it. He's, in fact, in Paul Johnson's book on the history of Christianity, he says that Augustine was the heresy arch, the supreme heretic, because instead of Pelagius believed in free will and that men could live holy lives. Augustine did not. He believed that you were what you were, and if God wanted you to be different, he'd make it different, kind of a thing. And he lived it out. He lived it out in his family. He lived it out in his leadership in the Catholic Church by creating the Inquisition. And when you think about it, Paul Johnson, this is his explanation. He said, Augustine didn't believe man had the power to morally change. What do you do with a man? You give him one or two options. You say, look, you have to become like me and think like me, or I'll kill you. And so if they don't, if they say, well, I'm not going to become like you, you only got one option left. If you put that on the table, that's the direction you're going to go. Now, not everybody, because the Catholic Church grew by leaps and bounds with that philosophy, that we would, if you don't agree with us, you have to die. Okay, and so I never saw that when I was in Calvinist schools or teaching, but that's the way they think. That's that there isn't any way out except through force, and there's no way to change a person's mind except through force, and so that's what you have. And so since it was successful in grabbing the attention of the population of young people, that the only way for transformation is force. And so what are they going to do when they see evil? That's their option. They're going to interpret that as God. So, but that's my own analysis of that. Now, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I don't fear evil, for you are with me. Your rod and staff, they comfort me. And the rod is more executive, and the staff is leading, guiding, saving. The rod is for hitting, okay? So he is restoring our life, and he's giving us hope in the valley of death itself. Even as we face death, as Jesus says, we're not afraid, because he's with us. I fear no evil, for you are with me. The issue of, and it all comes back to that one statement, you are with me. And that's exactly what he said to Moses. What am I going to say to the people in Egypt? What am I going to tell them? And he said, I'm going to be there. You're missing the elephant in the room, guy. I'm going with you. I'm going with you. And when later on in that, when God says, I will send, God is mad at the people. And so he says to Moses, after Moses prays and God is gracious to the people, then God says, but he changes. He says, you go down, lead the people, I will send an angel, and the angel will take them down into the promised land. And what was Moses' response? If you don't go, I don't go. I'm not going without you. And so the key, this is that I will fear no evil, for why? You are with me. Now, theology has a huge factor in how we think. People don't even know that. They think a certain way because that's the way theology goes. That's the way the popular theology goes. Now, if you have a God that cannot relate to time or space, you do not have a God that's with you. I don't care how you twist and turn it. If God is outside of space and time, I don't even think that's possible. I don't think that's a rational term even. But if that's the way you think, it's real, whether it is real or not. If you think that God is outside of space and time, then it's going to affect your prayer. It's going to affect your attitude towards God. It's going to affect your closeness with him. It's going to affect your view of providence in history, so that providence in history is God not responding to us, but actually just carrying out a plan that he has put in place, in the infinite past. So I don't think that's it's necessary for us to think that way. I know that I would be called a heretic for saying that, but I just said it, so that's okay. So that's why I'm telling you, my reputation preceded me when I came here, and they already knew I was doing that. And the big push in the Free Church was to get me and people like me out, so that they could go back to being. They never were. Free Church was never a Calvinist church. It was always a Puritan or a European revival church and missions and prayer, and that's what the emphasis was. So, but he said, you can walk in the valley of death, but I'm with you. I'm with you in that. And by the way, that guy came to believe in God. Sitting there in the dark. When someone brought in, all of a sudden, just out of the blue, they walk in and hand a tea of hot tea to the guys in the part of the tunnel where he was. There were a couple of other men. They saw God. They just saw God walked in and handed them some tea. And it got so common that when anything happened, it happened right at the specific time that they were at their wits' end. You know, they were about ready to go crazy. And they said, you know, something's got to happen here. Oh, and some soldier comes in and gives them a loaf of bread or whatever. And he saw that little tiny step into that tunnel of death was the presence of God. And he just couldn't, after 400 days, he couldn't deny it anymore. I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and staff, they comfort me. I mean, think about that. You don't think of a staff and a rod being a comfort. But that's, you know, God's discipline, God's direction in our life can bring comfort if we understand who he is. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You've anointed my head with oil. You know, we can be completely surrounded by people trying to destroy our lifestyle, destroy our area. But you know, we're not preparing for here anyway. We're not preparing to stay a long time. You know, people keep, you know, I've had this approach many times. People approach me with saving gold. What are you going to do with it? You know, you going to help them do pavement up there, donate it to the street commission in heaven? You know. No, we're preparing to be in a place where God is there. He's with us all the time. And so God prepares us. He takes care of us, even in times where people have. I had never dreamed. I've been around some people that were involved in some of the deepest parts of politics. You know, one of the guys I know built some big radar system for the United States government. Then they didn't want it after he spent lots of money on it. And so he took it down to Taiwan and sold it to Chiang Kai-shek. I didn't say that right, but and they were close friends anyway. So I've just seen a lot of things, and you can focus on the evil of this world so much it drives you crazy, drive you absolutely nuts, and you become so bitter and angry. One of the big engineers that was working for Bell Helicopters was a godly man, and he had been in every kind of protest, not street protest, but, you know, politically, because the guys that I hung around when I was in Chicago were engineers with lots of money, and that wasn't a factor, but it just started to destroy him. And he finally one day said, you know, I'm going to go pray, and that's all he did for the next years and years and years, pray. Get before God and pray. because it was destroying him. And God prepares a table before us in the presence of evil and our enemies and all kinds. He anoints my head with oil. My cup overflows. And what is it that overflows? It's the goodness and loving mercy of God. It will follow me all the days of my life. And not because there's not evil, not because, the Christians are going to defeat the enemy. It's the presence of God, being in the presence of God and knowing him and being known by him. And he closes the psalm as, I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Not all of the near-death experiences are really interesting to me. As one guy that had a vision, and he had, his dog was there, his house was there. I mean, I'm just going, it doesn't ring with me at all. And last place I want to do is be in a house, Then are we going to put locks on the doors? What are we going to do with the house? Anyway, but I still like the image of this being my house. And now there are temples and stuff, but I'm not interested in a house. But I am interested in the presence of God, the presence of Yahweh forever and ever and ever. And that's, the shepherd's psalm is looking up. It is not about having more land and with greener pastures, It's not, it's eternity, being in the presence of God for eternity. Let's pray. Father, we just thank you for today, and I just ask your blessing, and that you bless and be with us. In Jesus' name,